I want to home in on this area right now because folks say this structure has to be leaking. First of all, understand that this structure can't leak because the superficial aquifer is below the structure. The water can't even get to the structure even right now. The structure's gates are physically closed.
Good evening. I want to welcome everyone here. I'm glad to see a big turnout like this at our Stormwater Management Lake Level Workshop. We're going to go through a presentation by Bill Musser from Tetra Tech, a professional engineer that's one of our consultants. And we'd like to go through that without stopping for questions and interruptions. After the presentation is made, if there's items or topics that we have not covered, we will discuss those at that time. Like I say, I'm happy to see everybody here. It's an important issue. We get a lot of emails concerning the lake levels and stormwater, so hopefully we can get through this presentation, probably 45, 50 minutes or so. And if we haven't answered your questions by then, we can discuss it as I previously said. And without me standing up here talking too much, by the way, my name is Dave Denny. I'm the Public Works Director for the city. And I'd like to introduce Bill Musser now with Tetra Tech, and he'll take us through this presentation. And thank you very much.
Good evening. I'm Bill Musser. With me, by the way, is Mike Saxton, who will be assisting me, also from Tetra Tech. To start this thing, I'd just like to, one thing I'd like to mention is that we've tried to have a couple of these workshops before and have not had this type of turnout. We're very pleased to have this turnout, but one of the things we're going to do tonight is we're actually going to tape this tonight so that this can be made available to other public members that weren't able to make it, because what we're really trying to achieve here today is to make sure that all the information gets out there and you all have what we have in terms of information. So I'm just going to launch right into it with that, but I got to get the technology working here. Well, let me back up and say this first. The purpose of this particular workshop, we've had a couple of different ones with different emphases. Obviously, we're in a drought now. The lakes are low. If the lakes were really high, we have typically a totally different group of people that comes in that has concerns. When the lakes are low, we get another totally group of people that come in that are concerns. And we're going to try and talk about both of those concerns. When we mentioned there was a lot of emails that are coming through, one of the things we've noticed is there's a lot of misinformation on these email chains that's coming in. So my goal tonight, when I was asked to do this assignment, is to take a look at all the information that's being passed back and forth through emails, try and make kind of a master list of the main questions that are out there, and try and give you the information as we know it, and try and hopefully debunk some of the misinformation that's being promulgated out there. So I'm going to real quickly just show you what I see as the top questions we're going to blow through here, and anything that's not covered we will cover afterwards. What is a landlocked basin and why is it important? What is the normal, whoa, I got loud all of a sudden. What is the normal range of the lake levels? When I say normal, I'm talking historically. What is the normal range of rainfall in this area? What other hydrologic factors affect lake levels? And yes, we will talk about the factors that aren't natural, that could be man-made, that people have concerns about. How often do we expect these water levels to be what we're seeing today? How fast can the water levels recover? I know that's on a lot of people's mind. We've seen it in the emails. How slow could it be before the water levels recover? We'll cover that today. How do the water levels compare to history? Does the city and or St. Johns River Water Management District regulate our lake levels? A lot of misinformation out there. We're going to clear that up. Where are the outfall structures located? How are they used? When were they used last? What happened before we had an emergency outfall structure and why did we put it in? I don't know how many people in this audience that were here when this room was packed wall to wall with people, and we had 5 television stations and made national news for flooding. I don't know how many folks are in here today, but I'll tell you, I was in that room that day, and that was only about 4 years ago. So we're going to talk about why the emergency outfall structure is there in the first place. When does the city intend to use it again? It's on a lot of people's mind. What prevents that structure from draining our lakes? How are the lakes connected? When do the lakes actually interconnect and interplay? What will it take to use the outfall, this is the emergency outfall, in a proactive manner instead of a reactive manner? And I'm just going to real quickly make you understand what that means. This emergency outfall structure was used when there was flooding in streets and all over property in Deltona to react after the situation to bring the water down. A proactive use would be to say the water level's at a dangerous level, we want to bring it down before a hurricane hits. And that will be made clear today. What does the existing permit allow Deltona to do? Is the existing emergency outfall leaking? Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped on. Can the city and will the city modify the permit? We get that question a lot in emails. And then we're going to talk about all the emails and information about, oh, the city's got a leaky structure and it's draining the lakes and that sort of thing. And I'll cover pumping as well. So I think, if you let me go through this, is going to cover a lot of why people are here. We may have missed a few things, but I want to jump into this. First thing you need to understand is, last time we did one of these presentations, we spent a lot of time talking specifically about the history of how Deltona was formed. And in that, we went through a chronology of when the original founders of Deltona, the Deltona Corp., tried to take the lakes and interconnect them so there could be flood control. They did it for Gleason, McGarity, and Providence Basin. They never completed what they had planned for the Theresa Basin. I'm going to show you this later. I'm going to show you the actual permits and things that were obtained for that. But if you go back in history, back to aerials like this one here, 1969, this is what the Deltona, quote, lakes look like. And I'm going to say that because in 1969, I'm going to show you that that was an extremely wet year. That was not an average year. That was about as wet as you'll ever see it out here in 1969. And in that year, you will notice that a lot of these things that you call lakes today were ephemeral marshes, these little dark areas, like these lighter areas around the dark areas, were wetlands. These were wet areas, but they were just marshy. It wasn't deep lake areas. Okay. They want me to, hello? Let's see if that works. And so anyway, but all these lakes were landlocked. They didn't have an outfall. They did not have the ability, when they got very, very filled with water, to pop off to a creek or a river, and therefore, when it was really, really wet, they were very high. When they were dry, they were very, very dry, obviously. And every lake was, pretty much all the major lakes were interconnected years and years ago, but what they didn't do is connect the final lake. So basically what I'm saying is most of these lakes here were all interconnected, but not the final outfall. So there is so much misinformation about how these lakes function. I'm going to do a real brief hydrology lesson, and hopefully you'll bear with me. The green area there is a landlocked basin, and the little dashed area up here is basically where the lake would be. Mike, can you help me? Show the ground surface in the profile, and that would be your rain landing down upon the ground surface. What a lot of you may not understand is that in the Deltona area, we have a confining unit under the sand in the ground, and it's typically a clay. That clay does not allow water to percolate through it readily. And it's crucial to how these lakes uniquely function. So, the rain falls, it runs off the ground, it percolates into the ground, and with time, all that sand underneath the ground on top of that clay layer becomes, if you will, a great big underground lake. That is your lakes. That is what is called the superficial aquifer. All the water under there, if you dig a hole in your yard deep enough, you're going to eventually hit it. I mean, right now the water's down pretty far, so you may have to dig very far. But there's a lake, if you will, groundwater, all the void space in that soil are filled with a lake sitting on top of that clay layer. And what you call a lake, or what you experience as a lake or a wetland when it's wet, is what happens here because the ground has penetrated into that sand layer for the amount of water. But with time, the other factors that are going on is that groundwater table is going to move. Now, for those of you, if you think about this for a minute, the whole Theresa chain, elevation around 20 or 30, the upper bowl is around elevation 40. When you get down to the river, Lake Monroe, you're down around elevation 5. It's way, way, way down there. You got this massive river running all around the west side, south and west side of Deltona, and it's 30, 40 feet lower than most of Deltona. Well, that expression of the superficial aquifer, the river, and Lake Monroe, is where all the surface water eventually wants to run on the clay layer that's still around. It is slowly weeping that way, which is what we're showing with that arrow. In addition, we have evaporation off of the lake and what's called evapotranspiration off of the ground surface. And at the end of the day, everything else that's left does eventually, some of it percolates through the clay layer. This is the basic hydrology of how all the lakes and these wetland systems work in Deltona, because they were all formed by what's called karst geology. What happened is a bunch of sinkholes basically created all these lakes historically, and this is the way they function in a landlocked basin. Something that may not be obvious to folks, and I want to be clear on this. We also get water that we drink from the Florida aquifer. That's a limestone layer underneath the ground. It has a clay unit on top of it as well. Typically, because this is a big misconception, if I were to take a pipe and stick it into the ground and penetrate through the ground into no lower than the clay layer of your superficial aquifer and another one all the way down into the Florida aquifer where we get our drinking water from, what happens is the pressure of the water moving, the Florida aquifer is moving south through the state. The superficial aquifer in this area is basically moving south towards Lake Monroe. Well, what would happen is if you put a tube in there, the water would flow up to where that pressure is in the superficial aquifer. The same thing would happen in the Florida aquifer. And that difference is what's called a driving head. It's the energy that's between these two different pressure aquifers. And because of that difference, you get recharge. Water will slowly weep through the clay layer, but it's very, very slow. Now what that means is, if all the rain stops, you still get evaporation, you're still getting transpiration, you're still getting all those things, you're also always having a little bit of leakage. Always. So, what do we know about recharge? Just briefly tell you, St. John's has studied it. The whole bottom of the Theresa chain is so low relative to the Florida aquifer, there's not a whole lot of recharge there. It's like from 0 to 4 inches per year, which is very, very low recharge. As you get up into the sandhill areas where all the sand pine are and all the sand oaks are, all the little gopher tortoises running around and the scrub jays, that area up there is this dark area. You're getting 10, 12, 15, up to 20 inches of recharge per year. That's not the bottom of the basin, that's the top of the basin. So I can put this into a model to demonstrate what's going on, and I'm not going to spend all night with this, but typically about 55 inches of rain a year. The lake evaporation is 50 inches a year, and then you might get about 2 inches of groundwater recharge in the lower Theresa chain area, and then about 3 inches of it's going to kind of work its way down towards Lake Monroe. The basin itself, which is the outer area, has a lower evapotranspiration rate, and it has more groundwater recharge, and the numbers would look about like this. At the end of the day, you would have no net loss. Now, this is the important thing I want you to think about. These lakes would not go up or go down if those parameters did that every single year. And I can tell you that lake evaporation does not change. It's always 50 inches a year. I mean, it might move 1 inch a year, but it's the same. Most of these other numbers don't change much in a given year. The one parameter that changes radically, and we can't control it, is rainfall. It can be 35 inches in one extreme. It can be 70, 80, 90 inches in another extreme. If it didn't do that, the lakes would stay in equilibrium. So, as an example, let's drop it to a 40-inch year. Point to the 40, Mike. If there was a 40-inch rainfall year, it will slightly adjust the other numbers, but at the end of the day, it would come out in a net balance to about a 10-inch loss per year. And that 10-inch loss per year would drop the superficial aquifer. Remember, it's a big lake underground, so that the visual expression of what you call a lake, which may not have even been a lake historically. If you look on these old aerials, oops, forgot to bring it. They want me to take the mic with me, sorry. You'll see a lot of these things, even in the wettest years, didn't act like a lake. They were just a marsh. They were just a wet area with grass to begin with. And that was in some of the deepest rainfall years. Let's go to another situation. How about if we have a surplus here, 65 inches of rain? Again, all the numbers change just a little, but in the end, say you get a net gain of around 10 inches of rain a year, superficial aquifer gets higher than it normally would, and look at that. The visual expression of what you call a lake is much bigger. Now, if you think that this is a totally radical idea that I'm expressing here, don't believe my little math charts. Let's look at some aerials that I've brought here. Understand that each one of these aerials is at the exact same scale, 1 inch equals 400. Let me try and do this right. Let me point out that this intersection and this intersection is, ooh, it's hard to see in the older one. this intersection and this intersection, and you can see they're clearly at the same scale. Of course, the roads weren't around back here, but I think all of you can tell. Look at Lake Teresa. Look how big Lake Teresa was in a very, very high rainfall year of 69. This was a drought year, 1976. Look how small Lake Teresa was. Look how big it was. This is after the hurricanes of 2004. But it's not just that. Look at Lake Louise. Lake Louise had some lake area, but a heck of a lot of it wasn't even lake. It was wetland and marsh area. When it dried up, you can see it almost disappears. Look at the surface area, what you're seeing here, versus what you see here. Of course, it was all dredged out during this period. All the stuff you're seeing here is a bunch of activities where the Deltona Corp said, hey, let's make the real estate value better. Let's dredge out all these wetlands. They could do that back then. We don't do that today, but they did that back then. Because they were able to do that, they're able to get this very large surface area, and when there's a lot of rain, you get this really neat real estate-looking lake thing. Obviously, it's very artificial looking. This is what it looked like back then. Okay. This may seem like a little bit of a smart aleck slide, but it's really not. It's amazing how often when we read emails and talk to the public, they perceive the way the lakes function is the way they see their swimming pool or any other water body like that, because it's something tangible they can relate to. People can't relate to what the water is doing under the ground in the soil on top of the clay, the little lecture I just went through. Bottom line is, let's look at your swimming pool. Rain comes down. It's typically designed not to go into the pool, to go away from the pool, and it evaporates. There's a great big concrete liner around that thing, and it does not interact and interface with the clay or the superficial aquifer or anything else. Why this is important is when we talk about issues dealing with pumping, the public perceives often that when you pump one of the lakes in Deltona, they function like what would happen with your swimming pool. Think about it, with your swimming pool. If it's raining and evaporating at the same rate, you never fill it with water. If all of a sudden it rains really crazy, you have to turn on the discharge valve and get rid of some of your water. And sometimes we have these droughts and you end up filling up your pool all the time. Well, I'm going to show you how this relates to a pumping exercise, because we have a lot of misunderstanding about what happens when we pump lakes, even during the floods. There is some benefit in pumping the lakes with the floods. There's no question we've kept water out of people's houses by pumping during the extreme floods we're going to talk about. But at the end of the day, this is what happens. You set your pump up, and it starts sucking the water down. But all that blue water on top of that clay layer wants to push in through the sides of the pond because it feels the hydraulic pressure, and it in fact does. So, and I don't know if there's anyone in this room that's a general contractor. Is there anyone in here that's a general contractor? You are? Have you worked with well points before? Excellent. So if I get bombarded with questions later, maybe you can talk to folks about this. When he's trying to do his construction work and he gets into the water table, he can't compact the soil, he can't do what he has to do. He goes in, he puts in well points, and it artificially does what I just showed you in this diagram to keep it where he can use his equipment. What happens if you pull those well points out? Water goes right back, doesn't it? You'd be surprised how many folks don't believe that happens. They see it as a swimming pool, that there's some sort of liner under these ponds. So that's one of the reasons why that folks aren't allowed to sit there and just constantly pump. There's permits against that. You can do it temporarily to do some construction or to prevent some flooding, but you can't just have a pump going all the time there, sucking your lakes dry. And the superficial aquifer is where the water ultimately comes from. So now it's time to understand, what have these lakes historically done? Now, I don't know how many of you folks have been here for years and years, but I will tell you that the Miami Engineering Corporation for 1 decade back in the 70s, and then the St. John's, the lake monitoring program, before Deltona had its own program, monitored the Theresa chain of lakes at Lake Butler and some other areas and took a number of measurements. And we have 10 years of good records in those 2 decades. And what's amazing is look at the range, the fluctuation of water tables from elevation 12 to 26. Let's see if I can do the math. Was that 14 feet of fluctuation? None of these decades were due to a 100-year storm or some massive, unusual rainfall event per se. It's just the natural fluctuations of the lakes, as you see in these aerials. And by the way, while I'm on the topic of aerials, I have some other aerials behind these aerials. I've got a full city 1984 that we can show you later, and a full city 1969. I didn't bring in every aerial we have, but I've got a number to look at. So when the lakes are high, this is what it looks like. When the lakes are low, this is what it looks like. Come on, it's supposed to animate. There we go. For some reason, it was slow. And so I wanted to not only show you a ground visual picture of what I'm talking about, and not only the math model of what I'm talking about, but also want to relate it to, I can show you this on a citywide basis. You can go into the public record and pull these aerials out and look at them for yourself. And there, I may want to go back to this later. I'm going to move on. When we talk about the flood elevations and what the lakes do, let's understand the reliability of the records as well. The city has had to, and even prior to the city, there's been lake level monitoring stations. We keep adding more, and we're in the process of even adding more, and this is an exhibit that shows you where they were, where they're going, and there's more going in. The one thing that we haven't had is a rainfall monitoring station that's been in the city of Deltona. So what we've done is we've relied on the rainfall records from whatever federal or state records that we could get. And we'll explain that a little bit more. But in the future here, some of these lake level stations will also have rainfall stations. They'll all be automated, and the data will be given to our Public Works Department. I don't have that data now because they haven't been installed, but we're in the process of putting them in. When you go around the city and you see these little staff gauges off to the right, that's where we've been manually measuring them for about the past 6, 7, 8 years. And they were measured prior to the city incorporating in 1996 by other people. But one of the problems we've run into is when we hit a drought like this, the water drops below the lake, and the picture on the left shows you the problem we have. We have a lot of incomplete records because with the lakes going up and down 14 feet, I mean, these staff gauges would be, you know, where are we going to stick them? Out in the middle of the lake as a boat obstruction? You know, so what we've had to do is put in these PVC tubes, which is called a basometer, and now we can measure the water table actually below the ground surface. And I think at the last presentation, there was a gentleman in here that said, hey, your records aren't up to speed. The water's much lower than what you're showing. I'm like, you know, you're probably right. I can't read the staff gauge that far. Why don't we get some basometers in? And you know what? We got the basometers in. I've got readings on that now. Dan O'Hanlon is in here somewhere. Dan, why don't you raise your hand? I'm going to put you on the spot. Dan works for the city. He's responsible for the program to get all this data collected, and he feeds this to us, and you know, we have this as public records. What I want to show you is this is just a snapshot like in 2006 when the water levels where the gauge could read it, like in Theresa, we have, you know, weekly readings. In this particular case, when it dropped to this level, we weren't able to measure Louise anymore. So what we've done with this improvement, as an example, is we've expanded our database, and you can see, take Theresa as an example. By 1/16/07, the drought had dropped the lake, yeah, might go up to 21/18, to where you can no longer read it on the gauge. We have all that data missing. And I took seriously the comment I heard in the last workshop, and I made sure that our piezometer program got implemented with our other program here, and you can drop down to where the piezometer was installed in April. And now we can tell you, Mike 19, there you go. You can see that we've been measuring Theresa ever since, and several other lakes as part of that program, and this is all going to be automated. So now we can measure what the, keep in mind, the water level in the lake and the superficial aquifer are the same thing. So let's understand rainfall for a minute. Now, I like to show this Orlando station because it's the only place in Central Florida that has a federal record that goes back like 100 years. Yes, it's not really close. It's not accurate to, if we want to really argue about, does this represent what's going on in Deltona? No. But are the general trends applicable? Yes. And what I mean by that is, I have taken the average rainfall of around 52 inches here in Orlando, I think it was, and I did a 12-inch deviation above and below. And what I wanted you to notice here is in this last decade, we've had extreme conditions. See those big black dots that are very low and very high? Those are 3 very extreme droughts. The drought of 1990, the drought of 2000 in the Orlando station was the worst droughts recorded in 100 years of records. And of course, we're in another one here in 2006 and 2007. I don't have all the data yet to see how much it may drop. You see the 2006 is a low value as well. But we've also had extreme highs. Look at Tropical Storm Gordon, 94. I can't remember what the other event is between it, and then the chronic rainfall of 2002, and we also had the hurricanes of 2004. You can go to other periods of history where it was much calmer. Mike, if you kind of direct them between 1958 and 1965, you see the rainfall stayed pretty common. you know? So that's rainfall. Now let's move a little closer to home, Sanford. You see the same pattern. Maybe the values have changed, but the pattern is the same. Extreme variation in drought and high rainfall. The lakes have just been going up and down, and rainfall has been just going crazy up and down in the past 10 to 12 years. Drought of 90. The fires of, when was the fires? Was that 93? I think so. Tropical Storm Gordon, 94, 95. The drought of 2000. There you go. But keep in mind, a lot of Deltona was starting to be built in the early 60s here and into the 70s, and that corresponds to a period of history which was very stable relative to what you're seeing today. And some folks don't believe it's possible to get these really extreme rain events, but the fact is there was a station right across from the City Hall measured by the federal government, by the USGS and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This is in the Lion Preserve. Across from City Hall, they measured over 90 inches of rain in the year 2002. That is the highest amount of rainfall I've had any of my clients ever have anywhere in the state of Florida in 1 year. I'm sure there's other places that have had, but I'm saying that is a very unusually wet year. You can plot all this data I just showed you where it came from and see what the lakes have done. I mentioned that it had been as low as 12, high as 26. This is data from the Theresa chain. The Theresa chain is where most of the concern is. I can cover and talk about some of the others, but you notice the focus is on the Theresa chain because we call it the Theresa chain because it's called the Theresa Basin, and there's about 10 to 20, 10 or 15 lakes that have all been interconnected through culverts. So they all act as basically one lake when the water is high enough to flow through the pipes. Okay? So, something I want, Mike, I need you to point to the steep slopes where those things were. Please point to the, thank you, the first one there. No, the ascending limb. Yeah. The ascending, I want you to do the ascending limb on each one. You see that great big spike? That's just not some crazy thing out there. That first big spike happens to be when Hurricane David brushed the coast in 1979. That next big spike relates to Tropical Storm Gordon, November 15th, 1994. But then we got very little relief from that peak, and it continued to rise in 2005 or 1995, and it reached, Mike, you're not following me. It's right here. It reached that height there. Then we had the rain of 2002, which went from that very low period where we were already down to about 14. And because of the rains starting in 2002, and in some places in Deltona we had 90 inches, the lakes went crazy up high, and that's when we had the emergency flood control device put in. Lakes started to recover, boom, we got hit with the hurricanes. All right. Let's talk about how we can overlay rainfall. The rainfall, I've plotted rainfall on the right side in inches. You see the 50-inch mark, and I got the lake stages on the left here. It should be no surprise to anyone that as a general rule, when it's raining, the lakes are going up, and when it's not, the lakes are going down. You'll notice the correlation is much better when I'm over here because I'm using data that's closer. It's right here in Deltona. When I come further back, I got to start hitting Sanford and Orlando, and the peaks aren't quite as good. But what this does is look how well these peaks are following, the rainfall and the stages. So y'all may ask, where are we today? Well, I've been measuring this. Dan's been measuring. We've been looking at the reports every week. The Theresa chain right now, as an example, has been hanging out between 19 and 20. I think it's about 19.5 right now. That's right there. And what I want y'all to consider is I want you to look at these aerials today. I want you to see what was going on throughout history. Unfortunately, I don't have a whole bunch of drought years. I happened to find an aerial in 1969, and 1969, you notice, will correlate to that very high peak. Hardly anyone lived here then to know what it was like, but it happened. And this 1976 aerial happened at a very low point. So you can see what these extremes mean. But what I want you to gather from this exhibit is notice how this water level that you see today is really fairly indicative of the average surficial aquifer level over the past 40 years. That's a shocking realization for some people, especially if you've moved in the more recent years and you've enjoyed this. Well, when I say enjoy this, keep in mind there's another whole group of people that come in here that get really mad at me because they don't enjoy this. And I'm going to show you why in a minute because they're underwater when that happens. But if you've moved in or you have anything to this, you've enjoyed high waters and lakes that look like this. If you had moved in here or in other periods like this, you would have seen another whole system. I'm going to prove some of this to you. Here's the 1969 aerial. This is what is now called Lake Louise. The semantics of the lakes are horrible because, Mike, help me out, was this Elizabeth or Catherine? One of this was called Catherine, and one of this was called Elizabeth, and this one was called DuPont. And you can see they were all historically independent, ephemeral marshes, wetlands, oh, and some lakes too. But now that they were all dredged out, back here in this 1976 period, they all got dredged out. Look what we have here now today. This is why when people start talking about these lakes on a map, and they're like, is it Lake DuPont? Is it Lake Angela? Is it Lake Catherine? Well, you tell me. This is all one water body now. It's all one interconnected water body. This piece of it here used to be this piece here, and that piece there used to be that, and they used to have independent names. But at the end of the day, what you saw with that very high water condition of those ephemeral marshes, wetlands, and yes, some landlocked lakes, was due to that huge peak in 1969. Here's November 1976. Again, I challenge you to look at these arrows and see how much water was physically expressing itself at the ground surf then. Where were we in terms of history? Right there. Way below where you are today. And you know what? Deltona Corp took advantage of it. They started dredging the heck out of everything, tried to make them deeper, which you've actually benefited from, because if your lake still looked the way they did down here, a lot of you folks that live down here in Lake Louise that say, hey, cool, we have lakefront property, would actually be on marsh grass property. Because they dug them out deeper, you get a little bit of benefit there. The problem is, though, the groundwater table still drops, as you see in the map. And then here's what you get to enjoy in a year like 2004 when the hurricanes came. And this was right off of the back of 2002 and 2003, which were record years. This is when the lakes are just brimming with water. Boom. So, how often can we expect this to happen? We can do exceedance curves. And what I can do here is I interpolated in the middle because we don't have actual lake stages there. I took the rainfall records and I've interpolated that to give you my best guess. And, you know, basically, if you want to know an answer like, hey, tell me, Mr. Engineer, what can I expect after 40 years of records? When will the elevation be 19 in our lakes? Well, based on records, that year, but it'll be wet these years, and then it'll be dry, then it'll be wet, then it'll be dry for about 5 or 6 years. Mike, you're going to have to do this. This laser really is not good. Follow me across there, please. And then I get over into about, you know, the 80s. Mike, I'm following this red line, Mike. Try to follow this red line. So you had rain, you had lake, you didn't have lake. You had lake, you didn't have lake. You can add up all those years and do an exceedance curve, and you can know how many years is it going to be like this? That's your average right there. Or we can come all the way up to like the highest red line and say, for the people that might be in this room that remember the horrible flooding we had, it's like, oh my God, when is that going to happen again? Well, you know, I'm not God. I'm not the one that drops the rain, but I can tell you this. I've got 40 years of records, and I can tell you it's happened twice in 40 years above 25.5. That's the best I can tell you. I can tell you it's going to happen again. Can't tell you when, but it's going to happen again. So, how fast can the water come back in the lakes? I know a lot of you are like, okay, this is all interesting, but the bottom line is, I want to enjoy this again. How soon can that happen? Well, the only thing I can do is tell you how the lakes have hydrologically responded in the past. Might kind of point to the steepest ascending curves you can. There's one. There's one. But that one right there is clearly the steepest curve. That is what nature can do. You want to know what's the best that can happen? Boom. What is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 7 feet. The lakes came up about 7 feet in about 3 or 4 months. That is physically possible. It's happened once in 40 years. It could happen again. I can't tell you when it will. That's the best that can happen due to nature. You want to know what the worst is? Look at what you see as the flattest the lakes have been, and that is this place right here. As you can see, there was a period where the lakes didn't even get to where they are today. And they lasted that long for about 5 or 6 years. And the superficial aquifer will do that again someday. That's a fact. That's what it's going to do. I can't tell you whether it's going to come back the way it did. You see, look what happened in 1979. David came by and gave us a nice boost, and then everything came back again. That could happen. We could get a hurricane in October, November, if y'all are hoping for that. You know. But what I'm saying is, I can't predict it, but I can tell you that's your worst case and your best case scenario due to nature. So now there's this whole thing about, well, all these lakes, why are they all connected? Well, you're going to have to ask the Deltona Corp, and you're going to have to ask folks before this, we became a city, because we didn't connect them. But I've got a bunch of aerials here, and again, we can flip them and look back. Actually, I'm going to show you one right now that's most interesting. With our high-tech GIS systems, we can take these high-pixel resolution aerials and zoom in on them. And what I zoomed in here was this 1969 aerial that you've already seen. And I want you to see, was that 69? Ooh, Mike, read it. That may not be 69. That may be, it's on the bottom right. Yeah. What does it say? 69. It is 69. Okay. All right, Mike, you're going to have to point to this. Here, even back in 69, as far back as 1969, before Deltona existed, Mike, point to the spoil mound signatures where people have dredged artificial canals and channels between the lakes. What you're seeing there, and come up and look at it later, or where way back in 69, whoever had stewardship of the land was saying, you know what, we need to interconnect these lakes for flood control, to spread out the water, and they dredged, you couldn't do this today, but they dredged all these lakes and put these great big ditches between them, and these great big white things are these spoil mounds, and the one that Mike just pointed to at that scale, those are huge mounds of dirt. They really dug them up to interconnect them. Then later on, they got replaced with pipes. Mike, if you'll flip it back over again. Thank you. Ooh, what is that? That is 1984. Flip it again. No, the whole thing, the whole board all the way around. Yeah. I want to go back to where we were. Thank you. I'm trying to remember why now. Okay. You can see by 1976, Deltona Corp wanted to sell these lots. You find folks would move in. They platted all the land. They wanted to give you as much lakefront property as possible. And if you study these carefully, you'll see places like that area right there where they made a great big causeway, and instead of having a big ditch between the lakes, they put in a big pipe, and those pipes have been there since that period. It's this sucker here. Thanks. So anyway, this exhibit is a depiction, so don't take this completely literally. It's pretty close. The pipes there are basically to scale. Up at the top, Mike has looked up for me what our records show are the current culverts between all the major lakes in the chain, going from Lake DuPont up to the far north, which is up here basically on this aerial, down through what's called DuPont, Angela, into, it eventually comes into Clara, from Clara into Theresa, into Louise, through here and down, and it finally makes it itself into the Butler chain. That last structure is the emergency structure. It's the one that we put in. So the last thing that Mike's pointing to is the one thing that we put in as part of our emergency control. So Dave Denny has come to me and said, you know, we're seeing some pretty crazy things out here. I've got some residents that say, hey, the lakes are really low, and I see water flowing through the pipe this direction this week, and it's flowing that direction the other week. Or is it possible it's really going from here to there? Well, obviously, look at some scenarios. Here is the total range of what the Theresa chain can do based on 40 years of records, from elevation 12 to elevation 26. So within that range, anytime the water is below here, the lakes are not connected. Every lake is going to go up and down on its own based on its own natural properties of evaporation, transpiration, percolation, leakage, and what have you. If one has more rain directly on top of that lake, it may go up. But the bottom line is the lakes don't communicate through pipes. They're still communicating through the soil. The pipes just allow them to flow water back and forth quicker. Obviously, when you get up to about elevation 19.5 to 20, most of the lakes are interconnected. So a lot of you that have just saw the lakes drop below, down to this elevation 19.5, the reason it's been kind of funky for some of you is, depending which lake you're in and what day it's in, you know, one lake may have kind of flown from one lake to the other depending on which culvert might have been a little higher. But at the end of the day, all the water right now is in the ground. What we have to do is get rain and have the ground fill up with water, and the lakes will go up. When they go up, then they start, I'm calling it communicating, but they're flowing back and forth, and they act as one lake. And 20, what I'm showing is a pretty typical elevation. But some of you have heard about this emergency overflow structure. And what I'm showing you with this red line is approximately when that system would be used. So look at that great big blue band. All your lakes interconnect and do what they've been doing ever since they bought the property and Deltona Corp dug them and turned these ephemeral marshes into, quote, lakes, right? And that's your normal variation. So I think it's time now to talk about, well, what is this thing about the emergency structure? What is this about the city controlling the lakes? Why did you do it? What is going on? Well, the big debate has been around for a long time. I went back through the records. The Miami Corp had plans to control the lakes. They interconnected all the basins but Theresa. They got all of Theresa connected. They just never completed the outfall. Then the county tried to do it. The county got a permit to do it. You can go through a whole history of people who've tried to do it and didn't finish it, but at the end of the day, they didn't finish it, and that's why we've had some horrible flooding from time to time. But there's always been a debate, if you're going to provide flood control at these very, very extreme points, what's the right elevation? I've seen records where people are trying to do 21.5, 22, 23, what have you. And I can tell you there's folks in this room right now that would be very upset if there was a permit controlling these lakes as low as 23. And there's been times in the history of Deltona where the Deltona Corp or the county or even the city has attempted an elevation as low as 23. But I will tell you right now, they will not ever get an elevation of 23 permitted. And I'll explain why in a minute. But we had to determine what can we get permitted. And so what I want you to understand here is the two cups on the left show you 10-year decades of just normal fluctuation of your lakes, that 14-foot fluctuation. Thank you, Mike. The Miami Engineering Corporation 87 did a flood study and said, what happens if we take what we think is the normal water level, I'm in 1987, and put a 100-year storm on it? That's 10 inches of rain in one day. And they said, okay, well, let's do flood management based on elevation 23. That was done back when the developer was here, and that was carried on into the county's watch. The county realized this isn't working because between 87 and 95, we had Tropical Storm Gordon, 94, and all the flooding. That's why they hired Dyer Riddle to do a study, and they bumped up the starting water level, did another study, and came up with about the same result. Well, that isn't so good. Think about it for a minute. Most people have flood protection of their homes based on what can happen every 100 years. What I'm telling you is, if someone had gone back and looked at this data, they'd say, wait a minute, we didn't have a 100-year storm in the 10-year decade of 70 to 81. We didn't have a 100-year storm in the decade of 1990 to 2002. And yet the lakes naturally, because they're landlocked, they have no outfall, they got higher than what we're predicting the 100-year storm to be at that starting water level. So from a flood protection standpoint, if people were building their homes based on either one of these criterias that were set long before this became a city, their houses are too low. Bottom line. So the city incorporated in 1996 and hired another firm, and they went through a lot of trouble in permitting, and boy, I tell you, they had a dog of a time. But one thing that they did do is they said, let's be conservative because we can't provide flood protection if people are building their houses and they're calling that the 100-year flood. We better start the water level at something that's a little bit higher and see what the 100-year storm does. And when they did that, they came up with, this is where your houses should be above to be safe, because this happens every 10-year decade. And we want something that gives you protection every 100 years. This is what happened in 2002 and 2003. I'm just going to show you some representative pictures. Hawks Landing. This home, by the way, we have gotten federal money to rip it down and tear it down. It's the only thing we could do. It flooded so much. It was on Lake DuPont. This is a house on Melshore on Lake Anne Marie. The other pictures in the Dorchester area, that school bus kept going through that area for, I don't know, 5, 6 months or something like that. That water never went away. That's a home over on Lake Windsor up in the top left that's had water in it 2 or 3 times. The home on the right never had water in it, but you can imagine what the septic tank did with water hanging out there for 6, 7 months. The Beachdale area got a lot of press, newspapers here a lot. We ended up having to buy out and take a bunch of homes out of that area. We did a drainage study, and I've talked about this before, and I'm going to breeze through this because this was only 5% of the entire Theresa watershed. We did this in a hurry to get some idea of how bad it can be in the middle of that emergency flooding that happened in 2002 and 3 to predict some results. Some people criticized that and said, gee, that wasn't a good enough study, it was only 5%. Like, it was the best we could do in a hurry. So we've gone back and studied more over the last couple of years. Now we've completed, Rod Cash is another one of my engineers here. Rod, if you'll raise your hand. Thank you. Rod's one of our stormwater engineers. What does this cover? About 60% of the Theresa watershed now in city limits? About. What we've done is we've physically, I'm going to go back. Not ready for that one. Whoops. We physically have gone in and used the LiDAR imagery, the aerial photographs and topography supplied by the Water Management District, and photo interpreted many people's property within that area to see what would happen with the floods coming back. So we could predict and we can give information to your city council so they can make informed decisions on where to spend money and how many people could flood when the floods actually come back. I know a lot of you in here are like, who cares about the floods? We have a drought. They are going to come back, folks. But here's one of the things that's been interesting as I've done these workshops over the years. There's basically two groups of people. There's the group of people that object to all of our permits and say we're doing too much. And we plotted them one day at a hearing and found out they all lived on these outer skirts outside of what was the published 100-year floodplain of FEMA. And quite frankly, when we readjusted the floodplain to what we think is a more accurate depiction, most of them are really there. They're on that edge or even further out, which means they haven't even seen how high it can go and they haven't had any problems. The other group of people that comes in here and says you're not doing enough and gets upset tend to be the people in these orange areas when they're right smack dab in the middle of the floodplain. Gee, that kind of makes sense. So what we did here is we said, let's look at the floodplain for a minute. This study was done in 2004, and I haven't updated this slide, but basically, at the end of the day, if you look at what FEMA called the floodplain for flood protection, they had 1,700 homes in Deltona would have been in the FEMA floodplain, and they would have told you better get insurance. For whatever reason, when we did a research on this, only 78 homes in the city of Deltona actually had insurance. I don't know how that happened. Maybe they just didn't enforce it back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s the way they do now. You go to try and buy a house and get a mortgage today, and you're in a FEMA floodplain map, they're going to make you get flood insurance. 78 homes out of 1,700. The problem is there's actually 5,300 homes in the real floodplain, and I will show you in a minute why the FEMA floodplain is wrong. Still, the total insurance as of 2004 was only 151 homes. The good news is Rod Cash has worked very hard to completely model the city, reestablish what the proper floodplain elevations are, remap the entire floodplain. We've fought with, I shouldn't say fought, we have worked with FEMA for a year and a half, and they will change the map someday. They now have new maps to advise you with, but they don't have the money to change the maps, but they've actually re-permitted what we've done. So this gets us to what is a flood. People in the emails are saying, well, gee, I don't really count that as a flood. This is what I count as a flood. What do you count as a flood? Well, we can argue that all day home. I'm going to show you 4 different ways to look at floods. If the water level gets high enough that the lake backs up into your septic drain field so that there's no longer aerobic soil and it's no longer treating the nutrients, the nitrogen and phosphorus, and then it's leaking into your lakes and not doing a good thing for the water quality of the lakes that you want to swim and boat in, I call that a problem. That's what I call case 1. You may not know it's a problem because your toilets may still flush. All what it's doing is making the septic drain field inoperable. It has to get even higher before your toilets won't flush. That's flooding problem 1. The state takes this very seriously. Number 2 is when it backs up into where it's in your public roads, like the school bus picture I showed you. Type 3 is where it gets up against the stem wall of your house, in your garage, or on your porch and stays there for months. Some people have objected to what we're doing and said, we don't consider any of these a public safety, health, and welfare issue. You shouldn't try and provide relief for these people. The 4th type is when it's physically in the home, which everyone typically agrees is something the city should take responsibility for. To illustrate these, the home on the left is type 1 and 2. That septic tank will not work when the water's up there. The drain field's not working. They have nuisance flooding. The one on the right, it's all the way up to the stem wall of the house, and it's a nuisance. And the other house, you can see it's up to the porch. And that's the same for the other 2 pictures. On the bottom right-hand picture, I love this picture because that home stayed in that condition off of Hidden Lake for months. I can't remember how many months it was. Those poor people just really had it bad. But you know, the water never got into their home because the public works director at that time is pointing to where the finished floor slab would have been in that home because it's a stem wall home. Some people consider that's not a problem. I don't, and the city didn't take that position. City took the position that this is not an acceptable condition for the residents of this community, and we tried to provide flood control for these type of homes. This did not make it into the home physically on the carpet, but it was like that for many months. Type 3 flooding. This is type 4 flooding, where you got the mold growing up the walls and it's actually on the carpet of the home. We actually didn't get many homes that made it to the state because we did put an emergency outflow structure, and I think only 3 homes actually got water physically in their home. If we hadn't put in the emergency outflow structure, it would have been much larger. How do we know that? Because we modeled it. Move this around a little quicker. And what we found was, we were asked, this is what we were tasked with. On March 2003, in the middle of the, quote, dry season, the lakes had reached their all-time high in 40 years, elevation 26. The rainy season, where the hurricanes come and you get most of your rainfall, was about to come on us. And they said, well, what would happen if the 100-year storm happened then? Well, we modeled it, and we came up with an elevation of 29. Whoa, big trouble. So the whole debate came to, well, where would you get where's a reasonable safe control? And what we said is, if we could put an emergency outfall and proactively draw that high water down before a 100-year storm comes, we could do something that resembles more what PEC established for this city as 100-year flood elevations. We could get it down to a starting water elevation around 24 before the hurricanes hit. If the hurricane hit, it would flood as bad as you just saw, but no worse. Without the emergency outfall structure, it'd be way, way, way worse. Even if we didn't get a 100-year storm, if we hadn't put in the emergency outfall structure, the lakes would have climbed above elevation 26. So someone goes, so I want you to understand, 26 is an important elevation. That's when we have serious problems. 28 could have happened. And 29 could have happened if we had a 100-year storm without the floodgate. So we did this GIS analysis. Here's Lake Theresa and the surrounding lakes. That orange area is what FEMA called the floodplain. Now, y'all look at this and tell me what's funny. If you were to buy in a house right in here, people would say you're not on a floodplain. Look, there's no floodplain. Do you think the 100-year flood knows the difference between here and here? How about this lake? This lake's not in the floodplain. This lake's not in the floodplain. Obviously, that's bull. All these lakes are in the floodplain. These maps were created years ago based off of this aerial. So what we did is we came in and said, we got to correct this. And we got to tell people what can happen. So let's look at it. Study this area for a minute, and I will superimpose how high the water will rise. At elevation 27.85, this is what happens. The floodplain takes a lot of property and starts getting into a lot of homes. And if we hadn't put in the structure and a 100-year flood had hidden, it could have gone all the way up to here. Look at this area up here in the Lake Clara area. I don't know if any people live up in this area, but that's what it could have looked like. This is the Salem Drive area. This shows you how far the floodplain, that's a 28.5. A lot of those pictures I showed you were from this area. This would be up into the houses in this case. And that area off of Humphrey Drive. So what we did is we said, I can predict now with the curves I showed you before. Someone says, okay, tell me, Bill, how often will elevation 23 occur? I can tell you that after looking at 40 years of data, the only data I have, it's going to happen 11 times in 39 years. And you can go up that ladder, 24, 7. At elevation 25, 5 times in 39 years. And what they experience when we put in the emergency overflow structure happens only, obviously, once in 39 years. The 100-year storm, which hasn't happened yet, will be higher. So we looked within that, what Rod said was what, about a 60% of the area within the Theresa watershed, and we can now predict with that percent. Keep in mind, this is not everyone. I mean, I've covered your house. I've covered 65% of the people in the lower Theresa chain. And I can tell you that if that elevation had occurred, it would have flooded 40 homes in their house. And obviously, since it only reached 26, this is indicative of the 2 or 3 homes that did flood. So now let's look at the next curve. This is, do you find it acceptable if you have water standing in your garage, in your porch, and up against the stem wall of your house growing mold for 7 months? If you do, and we'll move on. If you find that offensive, because there's a lot of people in the city that do, then the city has taken a look at this. And what they said is, wow, oops, let's forget the real extreme events. Let's look at the ones that happen regularly. 26, can't find the pointer here. Just within the 65% area, there's almost 100 homes that experience the type of flooding I showed you pictures of 65% of the lower Theresa chain. At 25, it's 60, and even down as low as elevation 24, which happens 7 years out of 39 years, we're going to have 40 homes in the lower Theresa area with water up against their stem walls in their garages or porches. That's 65, I don't know the total number of homes, that's 65% of all the people in the lower Theresa chain. It probably, Rod, what would you guess? That represents 20% of the population? What percent of the population of Deltona are home? About there. So, and then if you're, well, and this other example, this is people who are upset when it's just in their backyard, in their playground, in their storage shed, in their pool. This is another whole graph. And on this graph, obviously this isn't as important of flooding, but to some people it is. To some people, these, darn light, these 450 was very important to them when we got up to 26. And then if we go to the next one, we can also do a rating curve of when the septic tanks aren't, not the tanks, the, thank you, the drain fields aren't operating properly, which is going to have an adverse effect on your lake system. And this is the most alarming statistic because even down at elevation 25, you know, you have 170 or so, and up at 26, it was, you know, about 500. And if we got into those big levels, everything's basically gone. So, what have we actually proposed to permit? A lot of y'all have said, okay, we've heard about this permit, and it's draining the lakes of the city, and that's what's caused this. Well, that's not true. What have we proposed to permit? Right here. 24.5. What we propose to do is have the proactive control to protect the safety, health, and welfare of our citizens that I've talked about when the lakes get only that high. We do not have a permit to do that yet. What we've got permitted only is emergency authorization use. When it's really, really bad and all the TV cameras are coming in town and we're getting national news and we're on USA Today, boom, in those years, yeah, St. John's will let us use the emergency structure and provide some relief to the people. They have conceptually agreed that the 24.5 is a reasonable, proactive measure for the city to do someday. And I say someday because it's going to require a heck of a lot more construction and permitting before we'll be able to use it in that manner. Realistically, my gut feeling is we're going to be hard-pressed to ever use it proactively beyond this elevation of 25.35. And the reason being is when we remove the water from these lakes and dump it down to Lake Monroe for flood control, it takes with it the nutrients that are in those lakes. And Lake Monroe now has been called an impaired water by the governor. And so for every pound of nitrogen or phosphorus that we take out of y'all's front yards, backyards, garages, or wherever for flood protection, we have to remove that amount of pollutant to do it. And that is very hard to do. And the best we've been able to come up with in the last couple of years is we have a couple of projects in 2 phases that will only give us proactive use of the structure, truncating the very, very, very worst peaks. But we don't even have these permitted yet. So what does that mean? When we shunt, what you have to understand is all that blue you see is your water depth in the lakes. And the only thing that we actually are trying to do with this emergency structure someday is be able to shunt the peaks in red. That's all. But there's another group of folks who say, but is that what you did? What have you actually done? Well, this is what we've done. Back when we were building the structure and it was imminent to get the water down, because we're in the middle of the dry season, we knew the wet season was coming up, we were already at 26. We built the structure under emergency authorization and we studied it over the next couple of years to determine how it should work and how it should be permitted. During that period that I showed you, the structure was turned on and off and on and off and sometimes open and sometimes not open, and it did have some impact in lowering the water level here at the very top of the curve. This lower part of the curve, it didn't, because we ended up in a hearing with some objectors, set it to an elevation of 23.4, and quite frankly, we had very little water coming through the structure from that period, and then we went into one of our drier periods and the lakes just dropped on their own. In fact, I challenge you to see the shape of this curve here and compare it to the shape of the curve any other time in history when the structure wasn't there. The only other time it got used was after we got the relief and we said, okay, we don't need this again. It's going to be 40 years before they use this. God's going to react and be helpful to us. But son of a gun, the lakes got way down to here, and 2004, 3 hurricanes came through Central Florida. Go back and check your almanac. There's only been 1 hurricane that struck Central Florida directly, and it was Donna back in 1961. It had been 40 years since we'd seen a hurricane go straight through Central Florida. I can't explain why nature did it, but we got 3 in 1 year. And on the day that this structure was used right here, the National Weather Service said, oh my God, we could get 20 inches of rain in Deltona. We looked at the charts and said, oh my gosh, we could be looking at elevations up here, wide-scale flooding like you can imagine. Yes, we opened it up for 3 or 4 days proactively with an emergency authorization from the district. The fact is, that structure has not been open. It has been closed ever since for the past 3 years. Need to move on. So where is the structure that y'all have heard so much about? It is at Lake Doyle, right here. A lot of people refer to it as the Big Ditch. I will show you later why it's not the Big Ditch. I'll show you the Big Ditch. But this is the outfall. There's a pipe here. Yeah, thank you, Mike. And then it's piped all the way down to that freshwater marsh. From the freshwater marsh, it goes through what was the Larimer property, which we purchased. From the Larimer property, it goes into a small ditch. There's a small piece of ditch there. That's that little segment, and then it goes into that wetland, and then from the wetland it goes under some culverts, and we eventually get it into the Bethel Finger. From the Bethel Finger, it goes into Lake Bethel. Lake Bethel's directly connected to Lake Monroe. So that was the emergency project that we did. This is the structure that everyone has been concerned about, and that's where it's located. This is what the structure looks like today at the bottom. There is no water coming up to the structure. The lakes are below that structure, and it's been like that for some time. The plates you see on top of the structure were put on not because the water has ever reached an elevation where it could have flown over the top of the structure, but it's because we had objectors that were worried that it would someday, and the city said, okay, fine, we'll block that up so water can never escape through there. These gates are shut down and they're closed. I want to home in on this area right now because folks say this structure has to be leaking. First of all, understand that this structure can't leak because the superficial aquifer is below the structure. The water can't even get to the structure even right now. The structure's gates are physically closed. But because we continued to get objections from the public, we took the advice of the Water Management District and we went to this location at the head of this marsh. We placed within the culvert right here. There's Rod Cash. This is the final culvert. This is where the emergency outfall structure finally dumps into that swamp, right there. And you're going to see Joe and the boys come in here. We build a coffer We dewatered it with well points like we talked about earlier. And yes, we put an inflatable balloon inside this brick wall behind there so it can't leak because of the balloon. And then in addition to the balloon, we did a double wall of bricks and completely sealed it. And it has been sealed for years. There is no water coming out of these lakes, and there hasn't been. Second location, we have gates. The 2 pipes on the far right are due to overflow pipes for the wetland. There was a natural base flow of water under that road where those guys are standing, and those pipes mimic that water flow, which we permitted with the district. I did want to show you what it looked like, though, when we were flowing out, and this is what was happening. We were flowing out to give protection. At this location, this is another place there's a lot of confusion with the public. These pipes that were put in for only when we're using the emergency overflow structure. There's another set of pipes down the railroad grade that have always been there that are there to take the water from the wetland. That wetland always drains whenever it has water in it. People were confused by that, and they said, well, no, we think water's leaking from your leak, from your leak, from your leak, from your leak. So we went ahead and we boarded this up too as the 4th or 5th measure of there's no water coming out of our culverts. But the problem is, down at this location right here, this is what you had before we built our project. You see that base flow coming from what we call the horse pond. This is water that's spilling out of the wetland I showed you. It has always spilled out of that wetland. It will always spill out of the wetland. It has to by law. And it went through 2 24-inch pipes. What happened is when we put in, we needed a bigger pipe to take the natural base flow that's coming out of there, plus our emergency flow when it's flowing. So if someone goes to this physical location and there's water coming out of the wetland, they will see water coming out of our pipe. It's supposed to. That water is not coming from the Theresa Basin. It's physically impossible. This is what it looks like when we were using it for emergency outflow. This is when it was flowing under full conditions. So what was the big ditch? The big ditch was originally designed in 1980 by the Deltona Corp, and they got a permit for it, and they meant to build it. They ran out of money, they didn't build it, and their permit expired. What it meant to do was to take the water from this area, this is the Lake Doyle area and the Lake Butler area, and all this stuff, you can check the aerials, all these lakes had already been interconnected back in the 1960s, and there was an interconnection between Mitnick and Big Lake. The only piece of the puzzle they needed for flood control in the city of Deltona was to create a ditch between here and here. They proposed it, they permitted it, but they never built it. It became so controversial, the city of Deltona said, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do instead is take it from Lake Doyle down to Lake Bethel, which is what we did. For those that don't believe that this is true, this is a picture of some of these ditches. I've got all these areas that will show you the historic ditches. This is the ditches between Lake Butler and Lake Doyle that have been there from 1969, interconnecting the systems. And here's, this one's hard to see, but you'll see it better on the aerials over here, the one behind there. This is the connection where the ditches had already been cut in 1969 between these two lakes. This is where the big ditch was supposed to be. So when they say the big ditch and all the bad negative publicity, they're talking about a project to connect here that never was built. The only segment of ditch we have is that little segment I showed you before. The rest of it's all piped as an emergency outflow. These are the facts on the table. This is the way it is. And all we're hoping to do is once you're educated on this stuff, at least people will be using the right information. That's the whole purpose. It's just simply an educational workshop.